Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. May I have your attention? Hello. We are going to start now. Thank you. We are going to start. We are online now. There's a broadcast, direct broadcast on a number of platforms. My name is Yuri Shevchuk, and I teach Ukrainian language and Soviet and post-Soviet film history here at Columbia University. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our today's speaker, Argemino Barro, who is a Spanish journalist based here in New York. And Argemino is not a stranger to these premises. He was our exchange research scholar in 2013. And since then, he's been in the kind of on the radar of Ukrainian studies program, and also in a number of ways a participant in the events of the Ukrainian studies program here at Columbia. And I thought it would be called for against the context of this onslaught of coverage of Ukraine, not for fortunate reasons. I'm sorry to say that is now the case with American media. It's difficult to find a publication, a major publication that has not devoted lots of space to Ukraine. And I thought it would be called for to find a different angle and a different kind of approach how Ukraine and the events in Ukraine are covered from the point of view of an entirely different country and entirely different culture, which also resonates and broadcasts its coverage across the world. And that country is, of course, Spain. So that's why the idea of inviting Argemino here with the talk seemed to be all too natural to me. So Argemino is a freelance writer based in New York City since 2013. And he works for the news site El Confidencial and the TV channel La Sexta and Televisión de Galicia. He obtained his journalist degree at the Universidad Complutense de Madrid in 2007 with a specialization in international relations and defense studies. Throughout his career as a reporter and documentary filmmaker, Argemino has lived and worked in multiple countries and has been mainly focused on the study of authoritarianism. In 2013, he was awarded the Belarus in Focus Journalism Prize for his reporting on the dictatorship of Alexander Lukashenko. Later that year, he came to the Herman Institute as a visiting scholar, centered his interest was Belarus. We kind of pulled him towards Ukraine very quickly, and we didn't have to apply much convicting or persuasion. And in spring and summer 2014, Argemino went to Ukraine to cover the beginning of the Russian aggression in Donbass. I remember him telling me that the intention was to spend 2 weeks in Ukraine, and he ended up spending, how many months? 4 months. 4 months. Ukraine is addicted. Since the fall of 2014, he has been the US correspondent of El Confidencial and other media outlets. In 2017, he published El Candidato e la Furia, a first-hand account of the rise of Donald Trump, with extensive reporting from the Rust Belt and the Deep South of the United States. His latest book, Una historia de Rus, Crónica de la guerra en el este de Ucrania, is devoted to the Russian-Ukrainian war. It combines reporting in the field and exploration of Ukrainian history. Argemino Barro, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yuri, for your generous introduction. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, all of you that are listening right now and watching. And thank you to the Harriman Institute for having me once again. Here we are, Yuri, 9 years later, and everything started here. For me, my relationship with Ukraine, as Yuri mentioned, I was mainly focused on Belarus back in that time, 2013, 2012, 2013. But here in the fall of 2014, if you remember, we had a very momentous coverage of Ukraine that started like going on because Yanukovych, then president of Ukraine, was supposed to sign the association agreement with the European Union. And last minute, he got cold feet, or another way to put it, he pulled off his probably original plan of using the potential signature as leverage to get more from Russia. He didn't do it. That provoked protest in Maidan, and I think the rest is history, as the cliche goes, right? And inevitably, I became more interested in Ukraine through the events in the Harriman, and finally doing some reporting in the field. This year, unfortunately, I had to go back to Ukraine as a reporter to cover the weeks previous to the large-scale invasion, and then I went back this summer to do more reporting for a few weeks. So I would like to start saying that I have a deep, I don't know if call it respect or even reverence, I don't want to sound too exaggerated, to my profession. I think being a reporter is very important. I know this might sound a little bit romantic because the profession of journalism has very low rates all across the world, as a consequence partially of the rise of social media and political polarization. More and more journalists are giving their opinion out loud every day in the social media, and the profession suffers. But I think it's important, even if you write for a small publication, for a blog, what you say, what you write might have a consequence somewhere down the line. Maybe you create a little footprint, and that footprint grows over the years. Maybe someone important is reading you at some point, someone in government, someone in the corporate world, and at some point your coverage might partially influence in certain ways. So I have a deep respect for that. And also, I am a little bit self-conscious when I write about a different country, be it the United States, or be it especially Ukraine, because the United States has a large presence in our minds. Everybody has been watching movies forever from the United States, following political events for decades. But Ukraine, for many people, including reporters, is a new territory. It's a new country, so speaking. So I feel the responsibility. And also when I live in New York City, like Yuri mentioned, when I read what some foreign reporters write about my country, Spain, sometimes I think they do an amazing job. I was a fixer for a couple of them back in the day in Madrid. But sometimes I cringe a little bit. And I read the first paragraph and I see Franco, and I say, Franco. I mean, he passed away like 10 years before I was born. I mean, it's important. He was a dictator for 40 years. But, you know, several generations of politicians have already had power and have like done things differently. We had a transition in 1975, 77. The Civil War, you know, like second paragraph, the Civil War. Listen, the Civil War, like there is hardly anybody around that remember the Civil War. It's been a long time, you know? So I can't help but think, am I doing the same thing with Ukraine? Am I falling into stereotypes? Is there anything that I'm missing? So I feel that, and that's what the talk is going to be today. I mean, if you look at Ukraine, we cannot know A, how the war is going to end, B, how are the historians in the future gonna look at it? Is it gonna be it's gonna be important for sure, but is it gonna be look in some way, maybe another? But I think it's safe to say that this war, this invasion of Ukraine has an old feeling, an old feel of like a sort of 19th century war, in the sense that for Russia, the conception of international relations is very old-fashioned. It's all about territory, blood and soil, conquering like neighboring countries, expanding, being respected. So this war against Ukraine is a traditional imperialistic war of conquest. And then Ukraine has replied in kind, in the sense that the war waged by Ukraine is not very different from the war waged by Italy in the 19th century against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And for that matter, it's not too different from the war of Spain against the French invasion at the beginning of the 19th century. Of course, different time periods, but it has a similar feel. I have a friend, you introduced me to him, Alexander Pronkevich, from the University of Petro-Mohyla in the Black Sea, Nikolaev. And I have a number of conversations with him over the last few months. And he said, he's a professor of Spanish studies. He said, the identity of Spain, the modern identity of Spain, arose partially due to the war against France. Kind of like the war against Napoleon kind of amalgamated the national identity in certain ways. So he told me, right now, Vladimir Putin is our Napoleon. He's doing a big effort, Putin, even, and directly to amalgamate even more and to get Ukrainians more cohesive and more together in this war for their survival. It's an existential war. So if you go to Ukraine, you will see that at the front you have judges in uniform fighting. You have movie makers, you have farmers, you have bricklayers, you have nationalists, you have socialists, you have all sort of Ukrainians from the north, from the south, the east, west. They're fighting. This is a people's war. It's a war of independence. It's an old-fashioned, all-out existential war. I mean, historians are going to have the last word in the future, but I think I feel confident enough to say it. And those who look at it as a sort of conflict between the United States and Russia for spheres of influence being fought in Ukraine, I suggest they will take a look. They don't have to go to the front, but they could visit Kiev, like so many people have done in the last few months, and just talk to the people, go to Dnipro, go to Zaporizhia, not far from the front, and probably they will see. I mean, militaries don't fight wars. Nations do. It's impossible to fight this war without the support of the nation. Military is nothing. It's just like the front line, but you need all the resources. NATO weapons are important, of course, but they're accessories to what's happening. So that's going to be my talk today about covering this very complex event. So I would like to structure my talk in 3 sections. First 2 sections are going to be about the challenges for a reporter to cover Ukraine, in my view, properly. First challenge, the image of Ukraine is still not maybe very well defined in the minds of not only the audience, but also ourselves, reporters. We have to do some homework, we have to study it, we have to pay attention, keep our eyes open. That's the first challenge. Second challenge, the organic creation of echo chambers in the media happens nowadays very often, reinforced by the social media environment, reinforced by our own group dynamics of being together with our comrades and people that think alike. That's also a big challenge. And then finally, the third section is going to be about what to do about it, how to report properly, in my view. I don't want to preach a certain way of reporting. There are many ways of reporting, all of them are good, as long as they are factual and vivid and simple, because it's difficult. On the one hand, you have to learn and you have to understand everything was going on, the economic dimension of the war, the military dimension of the war, the cultural dimension of the invasion, and then you have to transmit it in a way that people get interested and maybe they get a kick out of it and they want to keep reading and watching about Ukraine and keep it like present in the media coverage. So I would like to start with the first section, and I will do it with a little anecdote, personal anecdote. It's very little, nothing very extremely meaningful, but stay with me. So I have a wife, an amazing wife, and a son. His name is Constantine. He's 3 years old, and he has a friend he plays with in the playground in Brooklyn very often. And his friend happens to be Ukrainian. His friend's father is from Lviv, the mother is from Zaporizhia. They speak Ukrainian at home. He calls his dad Tato. They sport a big fat Ukrainian flag in the balcony. They have another flag in the car. And they are involved in all sorts of fundraising efforts. Last weekend we were in one of those fundraising efforts in Brooklyn in a restaurant. They're great. And, we see them quite often. And when I went to Spain for holidays in the summer, my parents very politely inquired about my son's friend. I asked, how is El Rosito doing? And El Rosito means literally little Russian. And you know how, what the connotations of that are, And I can guarantee you 100% that my parents didn't mean any disrespect to Ukraine or to Ukrainians. They know what's going on. They're in solidarity with Ukraine. They also have a flag, by the way, at home in Galicia. They claim to have read my book. Everything is, fine, and they suffer. How could it be otherwise, right? But there is a reflex, subconscious reflex, and they call him El Rosito. And I say, no, El Rosito is Ukrainian, and they realize it. No? And but this happens. I mean, it doesn't happen all the time, of course. Everybody in Spain knows, of course, that Ukraine is a country, independent, so on and so forth. Everybody knows that. But it's common enough. My brother used to have a music teacher. She was La Rusa, the Russian. Everybody called her La Rusa. One day I happened to meet her, and guess what? She was from Ukraine. There is a restaurant in Madrid. When the large-scale invasion happened started on February 24th, some people started writing bad reviews to this restaurant because it was Russian, and one-star reviews, you Russians, you suck, one-star reviews. And when reporters reached out to the owners, they were Ukrainian. I mean, to be honest with you, the restaurant was called Rasputin, so it really not that I justify, by reviews or whatever it is, but it was a Russian restaurant, even though the owners were Ukrainian. So anyway, this happens common. This is common enough. So why is this way? Why is Ukraine still a sort of blurry shape, sometimes in the border with Russia, for some people that haven't, maybe taken the time to read more about it? Well, I mean, let's go very quickly over the very obvious reasons. Like Moscow was the spokesperson, technically, of Ukraine for over 300 years. So everything you knew or learned about Ukraine, not everything, but a large part of it came through Russian eyes. So, of course, that has an influence in the books, in history, in speeches, and so on and so forth. So there is a confusion there. Russia is still a world power. I know they are doing very poorly in the battlefield. They have, the whole list, low morale, corruption issues, poor equipment, cases of spread cases of brutality, torture. Everything is negative from the very, very, very beginning. The economy is not doing great because of the sanctions and because it's very dependent on energy exports. Even before sanctions were implemented, Russian GDP was smaller than Italy's GDP. GDP per capita, Russia, smaller than that of Romania. Russia has a very serious demographic recession going on for a number of years. They have other problems. But at the same time, it's still a big country. I think that's a fact. It's a big country. It's a geographical power. It has borders with Europe, with the Far East, with the Middle East, the Arctic, Central Asia. Has a very aggressive foreign policy, has been involved in 13 wars since 1991. So it makes sense to have Russia in our minds, to have reporters in Russia reporting on what's going on. We have to keep an eye on it. That's how it is. And therefore, it has a very vivid image in our mind, in our daily coverage. That's that kind of like the organic thing, right? The structural situation of things. And then you have also some Russian influence that is conscious, is organized. Sometimes it's organic, but it kind of aligns with the position of a number of actors in the Spanish public opinion. For example, if you look at the extreme right or the right, even though the extreme right party in Spain, Vox, has officially distanced itself from Russia after the large-scale invasion, I don't know if before, a number of figures from the extreme right, they admire Russia. They admire Putin because he's an alpha male, because he's traditional, because he's claims to be strong, and he's close to the church, and so on and so forth. He's not a feminist by any stretch of the imagination. He's not for LGBT rights. So there are a number of things in which extreme right, not only in Spain but in Europe or even in the United States, happen to click with Russia and with the Putin regime. And you have an interesting phenomenon. I've been trying to put my finger on it for a while. Some former members of the military in Spain, even former commanders, they have been sporting views that happen to be very close to Russian views. They are kind of trained in the so-called realist school of international relations, meaning that they put the emphasis on geopolitics, geography, strategy, and they tend to not justify, they condemn the invasion, but there is a big but, and they talk about the NATO expansion as a reaction to NATO expansion. To be honest with you, I don't think this is entirely without merit. I don't think that the NATO expansion is the cause for the Russian large-scale invasion. The dynamics between Russia and Ukraine have been around for centuries. When Peter the Great swept into Ukraine, there was no NATO, right? When the Holodomor happened, there was no NATO. A number of other episodes, NATO was formed in the 1940s, the 1940s. So this is way beyond NATO. There is a big historical problem in the perception of Russia. It's not the place to go at length about it, but that said, you can look at the conflict from different areas, and maybe the historical view is 50, 60%, 80%. You have the strategy, you have economics, you have political circumstances. Launching a war is such a risky bet that no one does it for one cause, even if you're Vladimir Putin. Remember, he has been traditionally risk averse, even though now he's like threatening nuclear war. But that's another story. Anyway, the problem is that some of these former members of the military, they go all the way. It's not just saying, hey, listen, there is access to the sea, the Black Sea, Sevastopol, and strategic depth and military bases. They go all the way. And one of them, that is very influential, and he's always on TV and on Twitter, has hundreds of thousands of followers. He's promoting so many Russian talking points and saying things that are not accurate, but frankly, out of touch, ridiculous. He said, I think it was on February 25th, that one of the dangers of invasion of Ukraine was the danger of a civil war in Ukraine, because according to him, half of Ukraine will probably side with Russia. And he's like, how can you say it? I mean, that's a big stereotype, and it still persists. You say, okay, fine, let's see. So I spoke to Anton Khrushchevsky. He's the director of the Kyiv Institute of Sociology back in February, a couple of weeks before the large-scale invasion. He said, well, according to the polls, pro-Russians in Ukraine are around 25, 30%, used to be 50. Now they dwindle. You look at the reasons why, there are many, I can name 4 quickly. Number one, the Russian aggression. Maybe you are a moderate pro-Russian, maybe you want to be closer to Russia because your company has been doing business with Russia. Okay, fine. When Russia shows that it wants to intervene militarily to invade Ukraine, to annex Ukraine, to start a war in Donbass, many of them said, okay, listen, that's it. We see what's happening, that's the way it is, and they end up being pro-Russian, they changed their mind. Economy. The government of Ukraine, 2015, launched a decentralization reform. That's one of the classical demands of parties that were more pro-Russian. Give more money and more autonomy to the provinces, to the regions. That's what happened with Poroshenko. In 2 years, the regions of Ukraine multiplied threefold their budget. More money for roads, more money for public transportation, for new buildings, to invest in the community. People saw it. Number 3, roads. Big program to rebuild the roads by Zelensky, 2019. Many people in the free areas of Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk, bear in mind that even though those puppet republics were in Donetsk and Lugansk, they only took, this is because before the large-scale invasion, barely 1/3 of the territory of these two provinces. So it's important to explain that. Like most of Donetsk and most of Lugansk were free up until February this year. The roads. Many people commented on it and said, listen, we have roads. I mean, I saw the roads in 2014. They were horrible in those areas. Now people can do business. They can go to visit their grandma somewhere else, and it's much better. They appreciate that. Other reasons as well, the generational change. Many pro-Russians happen to be very old. They have their glory days back in the 70s. They were miners. They had a salary. They had this. They had like a polyclinic. I mean, they had a school. That's what they claim, what they remember. It's true that we tend to embellish our past, whatever it is. That's what they were telling me in 2014. And then like the economic situation in Donbass was poor from the 90s. It was very rough for everybody in Ukraine, people in Donbass. Anyway, generational change, young people connected to the internet, speaking languages, educated. They organically have been growing more pro-Western. So all these reasons, and even if you look at the 30% of pro-Russians, mean pro-Russian, that doesn't mean that you want Russia to annex Ukraine. It can mean that, as I mentioned before, you want to be close to Russia, make business with Russia, speak Russian, all that kind of stuff. Okay, 30%. Then look quickly at that. Politics. 2019, Zelensky won the election, 72% of the vote, second round. Zelensky has been the first president of the history of independent Ukraine that have been able to name every single one of the members of his cabinet. Every single one. There is no coalition in Ukraine. It's just Zelensky. It's him. That's it. Servant of the people. You look at Spain, we have a coalition. You look at Germany, they have a big coalition. 3 parties. You look at Israel, they have a coalition. You look at Belgium, coalition. You look at France, coalition. Marche, Modem, coalition. Look at Switzerland, coalition. Everybody has a coalition government. Ukraine, they have one government, one party. Look at the parliament, the Rada. 450 seats, 254. Zelensky, almost 60%. So he has the power. He has been voted for the majority. Is that a divided country? It's divided like Spain is divided like the US. It's less divided than the US, I would say. Way less. Zelensky now is the hero of Ukrainian independence. Who was the other candidate? Poroshenko. He was the guy closer to nationalist views. So Zelensky happened to be the sort of more of a pro-Russian, spoke Russian in his show. Several other people, he opened more Ukraine to Russian language, Russian businesses. He promised to negotiate with Russia. So he technically was the pro-Russian guy. Then look at Zelensky now. Would you say he's a pro-Russian? Anyway, that was a story that I wanted to get out of the way. But that's what he said, the colonel. He said, be careful, it might be a civil war in Ukraine. How does that hold nowadays? Anybody saw like any region rising in arms against Ukraine, support of Russia? But that keeps circulating. And then you have a case of the other extreme. You have extreme left. You have Pablo Iglesias, the former vice president of the government. He has now a podcast. It's called La Base. He condemned the large-scale invasion. Let me say that. He condemned it. But NATO expansion, but the industrial military complex, like we were in 1960, and Eisenhower was president. He also mentions that. And he is playing a game of being the contrarian. Everybody, the mainstream say this, so it's very profitable to be the opposite because, you always have a niche. And the consequence of that is that sometimes, if you listen to La Base, I do. I listen to, for example, a reporter called Rafael Poch de Feliu. I read his book, The Great Transition, back in the 2000s. I loved it. And he has a very interesting view, very different from the mainstream. I like listening to him. And I listen to La Base too. I listen to everything. But sometimes you have the impression that the talking points are very close to Russian talking points, to disinformation. So close that La Base has hired one of the main voices of RT, the Kremlin-funded propaganda media led by Margarita Simonian. I'm sure you all have heard her comments advocating genocide in Ukraine, advocating race in Ukrainian culture, advocating the use of famine to defeat Ukraine and to defeat the West, and all sorts of like extremely grave and outrageous claims. So one of the main voices for Latin America in Afinokenova is now in La Base. And I think like Pablo Iglesias is trying to get a voice in Latin America to expand his business. So then we're all capitalists. Right? So that's the situation, in my view, situation of how things are in Spain and why there is still misconception and confusion about what Ukraine is, what Ukraine was, what Ukrainians want. And I think it's a very challenging thing to do, to get, first of all, to learn and to know more, and then to be able to do the job of reporting and to explain it. I think that's about the first section. That's about it. I'm moving to the second one. It's a little bit more tricky. It's a little bit more, it's not that straightforward, but I think it's also important. The creation of echo chambers. And to talk about this, I would like to go back in time to a different country. I will come back to Ukraine, but I would like to go to Egypt in the year 2011, the revolution that toppled Mubarak. And I had this case in mind when I was preparing for this talk. And I called up my friend Francesca Cicardi, a reporter that lived in Egypt for 13 years. She was there in Cairo, based there, spoke perfect Arabic, integrated, great reporter for a news agency, EFE. And I was discussing this with her over the phone. I said, Francesca, is it true that when you covered the Egyptian revolution 11 years ago, there was an echo chamber and an information bubble that really didn't maybe portray Egypt in the most proper way? And she said, yes, it's true. I mean, bear in mind this situation. Imagine, okay, so if you have a country like the United States, you have a large community of reporters, right? And myself, we live here, we speak the language, we know the country, we go to bed here, we wake up here in the morning, we watch the movies, we are completely integrated. We follow the news every day. And if something happens in New York or in Washington or anywhere else, there is always like hundreds of reporters to call. A lot of them. It's covered, that's it. No one has to come. Maybe like one or two, but we got it, it's fine. But it happens in pretty much any other country in the world, with the exception of China, Brussels in Belgium, Moscow, probably Paris, London, maybe Rome, maybe Spain, Japan. But out of those few, Latin America, of course, Africa, the Middle East, Jerusalem, out of those, chances are that there is a small community of reporters. So when something huge happens in Ukraine, like the large-scale invasion of Russia, something so tragic, you need people there in the field to report. There is a big demand. So what do? You send your reporter, all the media send the reporters, and you have freelance reporters flocking to the country. But what happens? You don't speak the language. You maybe have never been in Ukraine before. It's complex. It has a history. It's long. Sometimes it's confusing. You have to learn that quickly. You can't. I mean, you need, your editor wants the article for tomorrow. Noon, that's it. So you have to rely on a fixer, someone to guide you around and interpret for you. And who is the fixer? Well, the fixer has to speak languages, be very proficient, has to have free time. be flexible, has to love politics in order to help you out, recommend you interviews, put you in touch with scholars, politicians. It needs also, willingness to work free time. So in other words, fixers normally are young activists. That's what you get most of the time, young activists. And they happen to be very pro-Western. They have a community of friends abroad. They have been abroad themselves. In many cases, they watch Netflix. They want free speech, LGBTQA rights, women's rights, so on and so forth. That's great. But if you do the coverage of a country like Egypt through the fixers that live in Cairo and have a very particular set of views, what happened with the rest of the country? Well, what happens is that when the dust settles and there is the first free and fair election in decades, the Muslim Brotherhood wins the election because most of the Egyptians are conservative, they're Muslim, they have a different view of the world, they don't pretty much care about certain rights, and that's how it is. I'm not comparing Egypt to Ukraine. I want to make that clear. Different countries, different contexts, different circumstances. This is a case of an echo chamber. And Francesca kind of confirmed that to me last week. Of course, I don't want to make a caricature either. Like reporters are experienced and they know the way around. But sometimes the big current of coverage goes the same way. Even in the United States, you have like all this large community of reporters. And you have scholars, amazing scholars, you have institutions, you have everything you need, resources. And then Trump happens. I have been here since 2014 as a US correspondent. So I covered Trump from the very beginning. My first book was about that. 2015, June, he announces his campaign. And I tried to make sense out of it. Say, hey, what's going on? This guy, Trump, saying that Mexicans are rapists and they bring drugs. I mean, what's that about? And I called up like a professor or a journalist and said, no. It's an anecdote. It's a couple of weeks to warm up the campaign. Don't worry about it. Okay. But he's leading the polls. That's not an anecdote. Okay, 2 months go by. Hey, he's leading the polls. What's going on? It's called name recognition. When a pollster calls someone in the electorate, hey, who will you vote for? And gives like a list of 14 Republican candidates. No one knows who Ted Cruz is back in the day. No one knows this other guy. They know Trump, he's famous, so they say Trump. Okay, fine, makes sense. Then primary happens. Oh, don't worry, like now people are going to be acquainted with the agenda, and they're going to do the normal, reasonable thing. They're going to vote for a reasonable candidate. Okay, he wins the primary. Then now what? It's like, is he going to win the election? Impossible. No one in the history of the US has won an election with an approval rating under 50%. And he has 45. Forget about it, okay? What happened next? You get to November 5th, 2016, and he wins the election. It's like, what the hell happened, It's impossible. I mean, no one saw it coming. I mean, it was weird. It was a lesson to be taught. So that was an echo chamber. And I don't want to sound like an anti-intellectual populist, of course, you need media, you need them. I'm reporting myself, you need scholars, you need universities. It's part of the fabric of democracy, 100%. But sometimes, we are human and we end up trapped in an echo chamber, right? So something I'm very conscious of. I want to probe and be like, hey, okay, hold on. Everybody thinks the same. I mean, maybe we should, I don't know, try to break out of maybe we're in a bubble. 2 elements. And now I'm going back to Ukraine. And then you have another expression that sounds very fancy. Symbolic capital. What is symbolic capital? It's a concept coined by the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, and it's basically the intangible resources that you have as a consequence of your reputation or a feat of honor. For example, war heroes have symbolic capital. Victorious politicians have symbolic capital. Nobel Award winners have symbolic capital. What happens with symbolic capital? Everybody wants to take a picture with these people. They're important, they're famous. I want to be friends with, Nobel Prize winners, of course, and actors, and put the, hang the picture on my wall, name drop their name around. Yesterday I was having lunch with, Mr. The Minister of Foreign Affairs. Fine. People like that, and it attracts respect. And my point is, going back to Ukraine, is like now the country with the largest amount of symbolic capital on planet Earth is Ukraine, because they have retold a very old and powerful story, the story of David against Goliath. That's a very powerful biblical story, and that's now happening in Ukraine. This kind of weak little brother from the Russian point of view didn't fall in 3 days. He keeps fighting 7 months later, tooth and nail, amazing counteroffensives in the northeast, and basically like breaking expectations. The Pentagon thought that Kyiv would fall in 3 days. Arestovich, the advisor of Zelensky, thought that Kyiv would fall. When Zelensky chose to remain, he didn't know that he might be murdered and brutalized himself. We know that today. That's amazing. How cannot you get like symbolic capital out of that? That's amazing. What happens with that? Everybody wants to live with Zelensky, and that's great. If you are an, Ukrainian, you are an activist, or you are just a regular Ukrainian, you want your country to be loved and respected, and to be out there in the media, because that means that it's going to get support, and it's going to get money, and it's going to get weapons, and it's going to get a parade of prime ministers going to Kyiv in pilgrimage and visiting Bucha and reminding the people of the atrocities that happened there, and taking a picture of the tombs and speaking to witnesses. And every week you say, oh, Bucha, that's right, we cannot forget. So that's amazing, that's good. But we're talking about journalism, and my worry is that sometimes the support is so big that symbolic capital also attracts voters and people that want to participate because they want to raise their taxes and they want to be seen with Zelensky. And again, from the point of view of activism and getting money for Ukraine and weapons, that's good. I mean, is it like bad that actors and TV hosts from the United States visit Zelensky and take a picture with him? It's good, Historians, they go there, they take a picture with him. Please meet with Zelensky when I write my next book. He's going to participate. That's amazing. But for journalists, sometimes, when you have such a strong current of support, even though it's good, your job becomes more difficult, because that current of support, especially like multiplied by the social media, what it does is that it raises the cost of maybe telling an information that the main cause don't want to hear about, or because you as a reporter feel compelled to support openly Ukraine and ask for weapons, and that's great, but at the moment you're not a reporter anymore. And in the end, all this comes down to the fine line between activism and journalism. Who are you? Activists, that's great. Activists are necessary, of course, they do their job. Awesome. But you cannot be an activist and a reporter, And sometimes myself, I share like information on social media. And when I share something that might look as negative to Ukraine, I get attacked sometimes, For example, I'll give you an example. There is an analysis of The Economist written by the editor of Defense. And he said back in a month ago, well, the counteroffensive in the south seems like it's going to happen, but I think that Ukraine doesn't have enough APCs, armored vehicles to carry the infantry, and it doesn't have infantry to hold the territories once they are liberated, right? And maybe the battle-hardened units are already a bit worn out. They need to rest. They need to resupply. I mean, that's an analysis. No one is saying that Russia should conquer Ukraine. That's just an analysis. I shared it, and I get like comments like, "Hey, this is information. Don't you want to know what's happening? I mean, why? Sometimes it's going to look good. Sometimes it's not going to look that good. Unless everything is factual and put into context, is good. You need to know." Some Ukrainian men are hiding from the army. They don't want to be recruited. They don't want to be sent to the front. I met a few of them. They're afraid of not having weapons and training. They're afraid to die. That's human. That's part of the picture of war. Not everything is that. The same thing. I mean, courage is real, heroism is real, but you have nuance as well, right? I need to talk about that as well. I need to make a portrait of Ukraine. So the question is there an information bubble, an echo chamber in Ukraine? Definitely yes, definitely. On the one hand, the bubble has to be big. So if you speak to a scholar in Kyiv, doesn't mean that he thinks differently of a farmer or a bricklayer or someone in the East. Many people think the same thing, regardless of your education or region. But at the same time, when I go there and say, okay, this pro-Russians were 30%, 25%, whatever now might be less because of the situation, I want to talk to them. And I felt like my Ukrainian friends and contacts, they did a gentle sabotage on me. And it's like, do you happen to know anybody pro-Russian? No. You've been in Zaporizhia 50 years. You don't know anybody that, friend, a colleague, a neighbor? No, I don't know anybody. Okay. I have to say, it's a very perilous moment. People are tense, they're fighting for their existence. I don't want to be obnoxious and ask. And in the end, I found them. I interviewed them, of course. But, you have to be respectful. And, I was there, but then I got a plane and went back. They remained there. That's something to keep in mind. But that's the thing. You want to also get out of the outer reaches, the gray zones around the war, and explore them as well, and make a full portrait. If you write 10 stories, 1 or 2 should be about the pro-Russians, whatever. They play a role. You might not like it, but I don't have to like them. I just have to interview them and put it into context. I'm not Ukrainian. I don't care about, it's not that I don't care, but it's not up to me to talk about the status of the Russian language or about foreign policy in Ukraine. I do a description. And then the Ukrainians, they make their decisions. It's fine. And the governments and so on. So that's something that I'm also thinking about, getting out the echo chambers. And then finally, final section. I think we probably stop here. Couple of minutes. What to do about it, right? How to do a coverage. So there's several things that I do myself. Again, everybody does it different. Some people do interviews or long form, short form, TV, radio, whatever it is, it's fine. I do my own thing, normally long form stories. And I try to do certain things to complete the portrait of Ukraine, in my view, for my readers, fellow Spaniards. I try to be holistic. I don't like this word, but I think it's useful. If I do 10 stories, I would like stories about military, politics, about culture. I did a story with Yuri about Russian and influence in Ukrainian movies up until a few years ago, and now how the national cinema of Ukraine has been, taking off and living in a good moment with movies that have been awarded. I recommend you, by the way, to check out his Yuri's film club once a month. If you haven't done it yet, twice a month. Oh man, twice a month. Next time, October 12th, Stop Similian. I'm gonna be there. I'll try. Be there. A story about that. Why not? And in the end, you tell a story about movies. And guess what? You're telling a story about Ukraine, and you're talking about the history about Ukraine, and you're talking about Ukrainians and about how they feel, and you're talking about Russia and Russian influence. You can do a lot of things telling a story about movies. And that's a little bit my aim. Not only talking about war, the front line, and death, and that's covered and should be, and I do as well. But try to round it a little bit more, to make like a round image. Another one is to do some pedagogy from my, knowledge about Ukraine. When I wrote my latest book, I immersed myself in the works of some historians, I interviewed him, by the way, a few months ago, and others, and I try to reflect that in my stories. I try to insert a little bit of history here and there, context, Normally, when you read stories about Ukraine that include history, is Soviet Union, Soviet history, I think that's very limited. You have to go further. Give you an example, 2014, May 25th, I went to Pereyaslav, Khmelnytsky. I think now it's called only Pereyaslav, about the, after the decommunization. It's a town about 100 kilometers from Kyiv, in which in the 17th century, there was this famous agreement, polemic agreement, between the Cossacks, the Ukrainian Cossacks, and the boyars sent by the Tsar Alexei. Basically, correct me if I'm wrong, the Cossacks were at war with Poland. There was a rebellion, another rebellion. They did very well. Then they didn't do so well. They were desperate, and Khmelnytsky asked for the Tsar's help. And there was a meeting in the church in Pereyaslav, and Khmelnytsky apparently demanded certain guarantees for the future or the rising Cossack state, Ukrainian state, to be respected by the Tsar. The Tsar, the envoys didn't accept it. Khmelnytsky apparently stormed out of the church, but the situation was so dire that then he had to go back and sign the agreement. And if you go to Pereyaslav, I don't know nowadays, but in 2014, you found this statue of two girls, one dressed in the traditional Ukrainian outfit, the other one in the traditional Russian outfit, as a symbol of union. It's a Soviet monument. And it was inaugurated or unveiled in the 3centennial anniversary of the Pereyaslav Agreement by the government of the regime of Nikita Khrushchev. So these things are important. The Soviets and the Russians kept it in mind. Vladimir Putin also unveiled a monument to Vladimir, the first prince of Kievan Rus that accepted Christianity and got everybody baptized. So there is a lot to unpack, and I tried to do that. I went to Zaporizhia this in July, and I did a story also. You have the Dniprohes, this huge engineering monument from the Soviet Union that inaugurated the first 5-year plan of Stalin. But then before Zaporizhia, across the river, you have a Korsitsa, the island where the Zaporizhian siege used to be. And you have like this strange dialogue between the Soviet and Russian dominion and the Ukrainian identity and so on and so forth. I want to tell that too. And also like brought around for, always aware that maybe there is an echo chamber somewhere, to be conscious of that, to give a round coverage. And I think I'm gonna leave it here, right? What time is it? It's like 7. We got like 35 minutes, right, for debate.
Yeah,
So
yeah, right.
I wanted to thank you again for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And then we can talk.
You mentioned and dwelled quite a lot about the understandable desire of yourself, and probably that's the traditional Western journalism, to be objective and to cover like all aspects, include them in your picture. Where does objectiveness end and being manipulated by Russian propaganda begin? Where do you draw the line when you simply find yourself broadcasting falsehoods, patent lies, under the guise of being objective and wholesome? Was that a problem for you to?
Yeah, of course. I see my mind all the time. Well, several things. Like number one, objectivity doesn't exist, in my view. I mean, in the sense that we are not supernatural creatures. We are all like human, commit mistakes, cannot know everything everywhere all the time. Impossible. But like everything else in life, you have escape. You can be very biased. You can be less biased. You can be just a little bit biased. I'm not going to say unbiased. I mean, you are made of flesh. Can't happen. You have your opinions. You don't realize you have your opinions. With regards to Russian propaganda, it is very pervasive, very active. I mean, you try to read about it. You try to debunk it. You try to follow Ukrainian thinkers. You have to follow, read history, follow journalists, and fact check. If you say, for example, we were doing so well in Dnipro with the Russians because we were selling them engines, selling them rockets. You don't say, okay, I'm gonna write it. They were doing so well in Dnipro because they're amazing. They were selling so much to the Russian and making so much money, and now they're worse. I don't say that. I say, okay, is that true? And then I call up a professor in Kiev and say, hey, I heard this. Is it true that they were doing so well? And then the man with authority in the Kiev, institute, maybe he's pro-Russian himself, but it doesn't look like it. As I mentioned, we're not in a perfect objective world. I know that. The professor might be wrong. I can interview another professor. I can ask other people, ask around in the pro. Were you doing so well with the Russians? Well, not that well. Salaries were not out. Okay, interesting. For example, I got a question. That someone told me that, and I found a economic report made by the European Union, and he said that there is a little bit of that, but at the same time, it was not that different, and then people left to other regions of Ukraine and made more money and sent more money back. So it's a complex picture. So you work around that. It's not about being the spokesperson of the first person you interview in the street. You say like Joe Biden is a communist, and I want to say, oh, headline, Joe Biden is a communist. No, I want to say, is he really a communist? Not really. Okay, debunk. That's it. I'm not going to include it. Or I'm going to include it if it's interesting, but I'm going to debunk it, depending on the case. And also, many people think of objectivity as finding the average. You know what I mean? Russia, Ukraine, okay. Ukrainians have a point, but Russia has a point. It doesn't work like that. You describe it. And sometimes the portrait that arises is gray, and you don't have a good guy and a bad guy. Sometimes the portrait that arises is black and white. It's that you have an attacker and you have a victim. When I wrote my book about Ukraine and Donbass, I talk a lot about Stalin. I didn't call Stalin a paranoid mass murderer, even though he was, because I didn't have to. I just said, okay, this is what happens. That's the decision he made. He got 1.2 million people shot, and the famine in Ukraine. These are the numbers. This is what we know. New documents. I interviewed another historian recently about that. Someone that is involved in the creation of the Holodomor Museum, the new one in Kiev. And he said, now we know we have new documents that they say that there was intent. So the difference between crimes against humanity and genocide is intent, one of the difference. So he said, in my view, what happened in Ukraine in the 1930s is a genocide, not just crimes against humanity. So you have these discussions. You have to contact the right people, or what you think is the right people to try to debunk it and offer it, and knowing that at some point someone might call and say, yeah, this thing that you said in your article is inaccurate. In that case, I say, okay, why? How? Because of this. Okay, I'm so sorry. I'm going to correct it. We're going to write a note in the article. And that's how it works.
My next question is, how has your coverage of events in Ukraine changed over time, starting with 2014 and up until today? And I'll put it in a specific context. Professionally, when you go back 8 years ago, and the battalion Azov in Western press would almost always be described as, borrowing it from Russian description, as Nazis or crypto-Nazis, openly Nazis. That was the first thing that defines them. Today, only somebody who's desperately out of touch with Ukrainian reality would still continue to describe them as Nazis. Mm-hmm. I know that I was Nazi in the Soviet Union. Only just the moment I started speaking Ukrainian, people in Kyiv would call me a Banderite, which is a Russian way of saying a Nazi. That's what how you earn that denominator. So at what point the nationalist, with all its very bad implications for American mind and I suppose for imperial Spanish mind, became a patriot?
Well, I have never called the sub-battalion or regiment, that's the right designation, either Nazis or patriots, because patriot is very charged, you know? I mean,
And so is nationalist.
of course, I mean, Nazis even worse, but I have not used one or the other, you know?
No, but about your peers, and it's not about your personally you,
Yeah.
but also your peers.
That's,
your
that's a good one, because I haven't mentioned that before. I was planning on doing it. I knew I was forgetting something very important. The coverage of Ukraine in 2014 and in 2022 is radically different. In 2014, it was an quote unquote a new country for Spaniards in terms of coverage. So many reporters, including myself, you know, I knew way less that I know now, and probably in the future I will know much more than I do now. I know now, but back then there was a lot of homework to do, a lot of homework, and the stereotypes of the divided country, East and West, Russian, Ukrainian, pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian, was circulating as a model to understand things, because, you know, human mind is very prone to binary thinking. We always are like Democratic Republicans, Real Madrid, Barca, Shia, Sunni, you know, it's always like that. And in Ukraine, what is the model that fit? Pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian. But then you have to go beyond that and look at the numbers and talk to people and so on and so forth. And I have to say that today, in Spain, those stereotypes are almost dead. In a way, I mean, except for, of course, you go to, you know, fringe media, fringe Twitter accounts, and today, I mean, I can read it to you right now. Someone said, oh, half of Ukraine was to be in Russia. It's like, how can you say that? You know, it's been like 7 months of the war. You know, I mean, you say that 8 years ago, it would not be accurate. A year ago, it would be like wrong, but 7 years into the invasion, you are saying that half of the country went to part of Russia. Come on. I mean, you know, you can just go to a certain. I mean, I try to do my job, and I try not to give my opinion on things, because in the end, if you do it, you lose. I don't want to say followers. I mean, I'm readers, I guess. You lose readers because most of the people, even though we are polarized and everything, most of the people just want unbiased, to the possible extent, reporting, and they appreciate it. And and if you only do coverage of one thing, or you are very passionate and activist, you're going to lose them, and it's going to be worse for everybody. You know, we have a lot of opinion in Spain, probably in the US too. You know why? Because it's cheap. It's cheap. Say, Yuri, you know, I have a newspaper. Why don't you write a column? I'll pay you $100 or 200 or 500, and you do it. Is it cheaper that, or is cheaper to send you to Ukraine and spend like a month reporting? What do you think is cheaper? It's cheaper to say, hey, 600 words. Come on. So you have like a lot of people in Spain that do that. You know, my pal he's smart. I'm gonna give him a column in my newspaper. Okay. And then that guy like talks about all sorts of things. That's not serious, but it's cheap. And if they are polemic, it's even better because it attracts like clicks. But that's a shortcut. So in the end, we have to bank on journalism. And I don't want to be confused by an opinion columnist, even though, of course, you can see what I think. I mean, I think it's pretty clear, but when I'm in the field, I try to do my best. How about that?
Very good. I would be amiss if I didn't ask you something concerning language. After all, I teach Ukrainian.
Yeah.
So, and I plead guilty as charged. There is a certain, but quite visible asymmetry in the professional expectations of journalists, reporters who writes about imperial countries like Russia, Spain, the United States, that if they don't know the language of that country, they won't be trusted. As simple as that. But for Ukraine, countries like Ukraine, knowledge of the Ukrainian language is optional. And that's what I mean by this asymmetry of expectations. And that opens the possibilities of being manipulated easily, like, for instance, the latest issue of the Atlantic Monthly there is a profile of a deeply corrupt individual there, like a almost like a paid for piece. It's almost, I cringed reading it. And I got the impression that the person was simply manipulated because not in the part of the reason was that he had fixers who kind of directed his inquiries a certain way and completely blocked him from asking, how about these controversial aspects of this particular politician? So what is your opinion about the importance of knowing Ukrainian when you report on Ukraine? And I don't mean to be personal in any way, but again, I'm talking to you as if I were talking to your profession in Spain. You're being a journalist or a reporter, a Spanish reporter covering Ukraine.
Yeah. So, like I mentioned before, like some countries, you have a large community of correspondents, and they are, of course, expected to know the language. Right? If you live in the US, I mean, you have to speak English. And then you will say, okay, well, of course, you go to Ukraine, you have to speak Ukrainian. But the thing is, the community of reporters in Ukraine is very small, at least for the dimension of the thing that is going on. You need a lot. It's a lot of demand. So unfortunately, you have a lot of people, and most of them, Spaniards, probably all of us, do not speak Ukrainian, you know? I give you a figure. Reporteros Sin Fronteras, Reporters Without Borders in Spain, gave a number in March. He said that in March, there were in Spain 75, in Ukraine, 75 Spanish reporters.
Whoa.
75, only from Spain.
All speaking Russian.
In March. Yeah, I would say this. I don't know there was not a breakdown of language proficiency, but I would say that out of the 75, maybe I'm gonna be generous. Maybe 10 spoke Russian. Ukrainian, probably no one. And 10, I think is a lot, but maybe I'm missing something. I'm gonna say 10. That's how it is. I mean, Ukraine is an amazing country, but if tomorrow something happens in, I don't know, Georgia was invaded by Russia in 2008. How many reporters from Spain are going to speak Georgian? I mean, it would be ideal.
So what's the way out from being manipulated?
Yeah. Well, journalism is frail in the sense that, again, you need to produce a lot. So you have to be very careful. You have to produce it now. I mean, it's not like, hey, listen, I'm going to do a story about Dnipro. I want to send it to you in the fall of 2023. How about, it's like, it's like, here's my former editor, by the way, Carlos. He was a reporter. He worked in a Confidential. It's like, when you did for yesterday, I mean, where is your story? So you don't have time to do much. So you have to go like working on eggshells a little bit. And it's like, okay, this guy, what he said is a bit suspicious. This thing, I don't know. I'm not going to use it because I don't want to get it out there. And, it's short stories, an interview. It's a little bit, it's like history in the making. It's like messy, it's just, you cannot expect, you can expect like the minimum that is being, unbiased to a possible extent, do your work, check several sources, and so on and so forth, and keep an eye out. Maybe your fixer is like pulling one on you and giving you a particular agenda, right? And I know a reporter that did a story with two sources, and one was Ukrainian, one was Russian. They were extremely pro-Russian. Extremely pro-Russian. It's like, dude, this is like a, back to parity, Shia, Sunni, Russian, Ukrainian. Okay, but they're both super pro-Russian. One was a propagandist and the other one was also a propagandist. He didn't know. Because he didn't know. That's it, I got out and people read it and it's like, hey, that's not right. And in my case, to finish with this, my Russian is good enough to get around, to do small questions, ask small questions, write it down, maybe like an informal conversation. I record it, I listen to it. It's there, I can move around, have a phone conversation, arrange for an interview. And my Ukrainian is evolving. I've been studying for 3 months, a little bit, doing my daily exercises, listening to YouTube videos, and it was enough to break the ice in Ukraine last time in July. People appreciated it, and they liked it. And, in the end, I have to say, like, Ukrainians are also, many of them that I came across, very media savvy. So they want to know who they're talking to. Like one, for example, a survivor of Mariúpol, I interviewed many of them, who sat down and he said, hold on a second, what do you think of Russia?
Who's in Crimea?
Yeah, I said, oh, Russia, and I replied, so I think the invasion started in 2014. And he said, okay, go ahead. So they're very aware. And when you speak Ukrainian to Ukrainians, they appreciate it. I mean, that's something universal, right? So that's a little bit of a way of breaking the ice and warming up to them. There is an art to get people to talk, in journalism, and I think that's one trick.
All right, let's open the floor for questions from the audience and from our internet audience as well. Do we have questions? Go ahead. And can you introduce yourself?
Okay, my name is Vasily Kokov. So you mentioned that you think that roughly 25 to 30% in Ukraine now.
Before the large-scale invasion.
Yes, so that's one of the things I want to comment, that right now my understanding is that about 10% or so, because 90% seem to support joining the EU and NATO. So that was a comment. And the question is, as far as Latin America goes, and then if you look at Colombia and the elections in Colombia, and you have the even more leaning towards socialism there. How do you see it impacting the perception of what's going on in Ukraine, in the war in Ukraine, in Latin America?
Yeah, thank you. For your comment, I would like to say it's very tricky to have polls in wartime. That's the thing. It's very tricky. And I know that poll is from rating agency, a Ukrainian agency. I've been going through the polls. This poll also said that Zelensky has 90% support in Ukraine. I will take it with a grain of salt because it's very complicated and there is a lot of activism involved everywhere. So, in my view, if it's 25%, was 25%, and then your cities are bombed and you have torture and occupation and whatnot, makes sense that it went down to 10%. So I'm not discussing it. I'm just saying, I don't know.
Maybe between 10 to 15%.
Maybe something like that. Yeah, sure. Yeah. And then Latin America, I'm not focused on Latin America, but I was telling Yuri before, a lot of people that are sporting pro-Russian views in the internet, they come from Latin America. An hour ago, I was being also hit on Twitter by Latin American trolls, frankly, because they don't have a picture, they don't have the real name, and they might be Russians, by the way, because some accounts were created in February, coincidentally, and they might be in some troll farm in St. Petersburg, speaking poor Spanish, some of them, but others are Latin American, they live in Mexico, they live in Argentina. And I think there is, in probably Latin America, I'm not too sure about that, but in the left, in general, in Spain, there is a trend of anti-Americanism or anti-American imperialism. And that makes them have more affinity with whoever is against the United States. So in this case, if Russia is against the United States, which it is, many people that are on that trend, that kind of thought, thinking, like for example, the new Colombian president, Gustavo Petro, they may feel that way, that Russia has a point because he's, responding to the NATO expansion and so on. So I think now in Spanish language, Latin American can say that it's more pro-Russian views and propaganda is having more influence.
All right. Yes.
Hey, I'm Sergei, the Gov Search. I'm a grad student. You said you have experience or knowledge of totalitarian, that's the place. Right? I find often in totalitarian regimes, the population is very politicized, but it's very specific. It's like, here's your views that you have to hold. In Russia, it's very backwards. It's very apolitical, at least from what I've seen. It's very, if you see interviews, they'll say, oh, they're all corrupt, but I don't really know. I let them do their thing. How does that happen? How do they create a population, for the most part, that's very politically suppressed and not present?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Totalitarianism. Totalitarianism, the thing with it, in my view, I haven't lived under one, thank God, is that everybody is forced to participate and to lie, because you have to put up a face and you have to go to the May 1st demonstrations and you have to say that you're a great communist or Nazi, but then you're not, but you have to lie. So it really twists your personality. You have to participate in the charade, in the theater. What there is in Russia, I wouldn't call it totalitarianism, even though it's bad, of course. Media have been shut down, journalists have been shot, politicians repressed, murdered, put in prison. But it's not a totalitarianism. The thing in Russia is that there is a social contract. That okay, I take care of the economy, and Putin is very conservative with the economy, with taxes, relies a lot on energy, doesn't really take risks. I regain some sort of Russian presence in the geopolitical scene. All you have to do is take it easy, don't worry, just participate, look the other way, don't be politicized. That's a social contract. And propaganda does an amazing job, because Russian propaganda is very interesting. Totalitarianism propaganda normally will offer a version. Okay, listen, there is an airplane that had been shot down in eastern Ukraine in July 2014. Almost 300 people, most of them Dutch, died in this attack. So the Soviet Union would have said, okay, it was the CIA. But then everybody will say it's the CIA, radio, TV, newspapers, politicians. But Russian media is oh, it's the CIA. And then in the evening, it's oh, the airplane was full of bodies. Someone detonated it. And then it's oh, it was Ukrainian combat planes, combat aircraft, shoot it down. And then the next day, it's oh, it was an accident. The one engine blew up and that's it. Or they were, so on and so forth. They offer you 75 versions. And in the end, what happens is that your cognitive defenses get tired. Another version. And in the end, that creates cynicism. And that's exactly what you want in an authoritarian regime, people to be cynical. Because they say, oh, you know what, Putin is corrupt. Say, oh yeah, Navalny is also corrupt, It's the same, doesn't matter. And that's something that Donald Trump single-handedly has been trying to do in the United States, has been attacking the media to say, killing the messenger and say, okay, the New York Times is lying and he's lying, and telling different stories like the Russian propaganda media are the same thing, different stories. And in the end, what happens is oh, Trump is corrupt. Well, yeah, so is Biden. So it's Obama was corrupt. Bush was corrupt. Everybody's corrupt. That's what it is. Look the other way. Keep on going. And that's how it works. The interesting point is that now the social contract in Russia is blowing apart by the day, because of that financial stability, even though a lot of people is poor and there's inequality, is not there anymore. And then, of course, you have the war showing up at their doorstep for the first time. They don't see it on TV anymore. They're going to be seeing grandkids getting killed, boyfriends getting sent to the front, and so on. So let's see what happens with the social contract. Yes.
I forgot my glasses.
Thanks for this eloquent talk. Truth is always the first victim of any war. We are all aware of Russian lies, but how much propaganda are we receiving from Ukraine? Also, have you fact-checked the many accusations that the UN Russian ambassador claimed last week on how we ignored all the Ukrainian abuses at the pro-Russian area committed in the years before the invasion? Most of us dismiss them without researching them, to be honest.
And who is that?
Oh, I know her. Great.
Can you say
Mercedes
Gallego.
correspondent of Grupo Correos. Thank you, Mercedes, for the question. Yeah, that's a great question too. I think that we have the tendency to, as I said before, to make an equivalence of propaganda. And Ukrainians are very good at propaganda. It has been amazing. They have been getting out like memes that are very funny. They are telling stories that they happen not to be true, but they're great stories, like the ghost of Kyiv and this Snake Island situation when everybody got killed, and then it wasn't true. They were taking prisoners. But if you are a war fighting for your existence, you are getting, you are doing everything possible to win it, including propaganda. The propaganda, it can include lives. Let's be frank. So this is very important to check everything, as I mentioned before. And some stories have a ring to it that they don't seem right. There was one that I couldn't fact check. I was not there, but it was strange. There was a man in Ukraine in a small town, and the Russians, the occupiers, went to him, and this man was the chairman of the local chapter of a hunting club, right? So people had weapons. So the Russians wanted him to give away a list of members of the hunting club because they were armed. And the man said, like, screw you, and took out a grenade and blew himself to pieces. And it's like, okay, well, how do you know that? Because you need a witness. How do you know what he said? I mean, he blew himself to pieces. It was at his home. Did he blow his home to pieces? His wife? Maybe his children? Or it was on his own? And if he was on his own, how do you know he said? So, and you see this like going around Twitter, oh my God, what an amazing story. And it's like, well, be careful with that, And then some reporters have been using the term temporarily occupied territories. Okay, they're occupied territories, 100%. You don't need to explain that, but temporarily, you don't know that. Maybe tomorrow they're liberated, that's right. But you cannot say temporarily, you don't know. It's wishful thinking. The same thing is like saying the forever and never occupied territories. I mean, it doesn't make sense. How do you know you're going to be occupied forever? That's not. And some reporters using that, you can't use it. You say occupied territories, and that's it. Don't accept language from the government, any government. And then, like with the question of, excuse me, let me make sure. Okay, the Russian ambassador claimed last week how we ignored all the Ukrainian abuses of the pro-Russian area. Well, in the Donbass, well, first of all, Donbass, pro-Russian, half-half. In 2014, Donetsk was like 50-50. So it would be right to say pro-Russian as much as pro-Ukrainian, because it was like a mix in 2014. Now pro-Russian in the sense that it's a Russian puppet state. Ukrainian war crimes. Well, that's something that the Russians have been claiming for a long time, including genocide, which is completely bonkers from every single point of view. Genocide is a very, very grave accusation. If you look at the deaths in Donbass since 2014 up to 2022, you have around 14,000, according to the United Nations. Most of them combatants, around 10,000, and then 4,000 civilians in the areas that get killed. I'm not going to justify any action of war. I'm not going to get into the context, but I haven't seen war crimes in that sense. I don't want to get into it, but if it's coming out of the Russian ambassador, I think the credibility is like -0. I'm sorry. I mean, you say like a Russian reporter, maybe some other, there are ways, but the Russian ambassador, scrap that. That's it. No, you look at what they have been saying, and it has been outrageous from the beginning. I remember in 2014, they claimed to have discovered a mass grave of a woman supposedly murdered by Ukrainian. It was a lie. They have been saying that for a long time. But no, he's not a source. Thank you. Yes.
This is the first time that there's no.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm Elisa. I'm a student. It's the first time that there's no West journalist representation in Russia. So, like, I know the New York Times closed their offices after they were there for the entire Cold War, for example. How, like, from your perspective, how does that affect coverage in general, and what's the role of journalism outside of Russia still get to the Russian population?
Yeah, thank you. Well, some reporters remain in Russia, even though at great peril. I know a couple of them personally, friends of mine, Ricardo Marquina, Xavier Colas, and they're doing a good job because they're telling it as it is, in my view. And we need that too. We need the Russian perspective, whatever it is. I'm not talking about propaganda and lies, but we need to know what's happening in Russia, of course. You know, if the social contract is blowing apart, we need to know it. If the nuclear weapons are being moved to the border, we need to know it. If they want to redouble the effort in any which direction, we need to know it. We need to know as much as possible. And we need reporters there. Sometimes not having them there in the field is just like it's a big problem, because you are not getting accurate information. And these guys have been there living for years, so they have sources. They also work around Russian propaganda. It's important to have that view. It's important not to be punched in the face one morning because you didn't know this was coming. That's really important.
We'll take the last question. Yes, go on, Emma.
It's nice to meet you. I'm Emma Matteo. I was wondering if you think that the full-scale invasion of Ukraine is somewhat easier to frame and explain for a foreign audience than what was happening in 2013 to 14. And what I mean by this is, obviously there's a lot more nuance in the situation, but broadly an independent state was full-scale invaded by an aggressive state, whereas during the protests, the protesters were fighting back, there was violence towards the police, a lot of the population was ambivalent, there was, with a certain extent of some pro-Russian activity in the Donbass, this is still very much debated. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on comparing how you were framing the events now compared to the events in the past.
Thanks. So we have gone a long way, because 2014, it was an experience of more of a discovery, more of a journey of discovery, you will, something like that. So we have to learn many things about Ukraine and the history. And I think now less mistakes are being committed. At least that's my perception when I read my colleagues, even though there were many young reporters in the field this time, and doing a great job with their resources. The coverage is much more round, a little bit deeper, and you always have, like I mentioned before, having maybe like two sources that shouldn't go together, because they don't give the proper view. But I think we went a long way. And also, you asked me my personal experience. When I was there in 2014, I was poorer, so I didn't really have the resources to. It's not that I'm wealthy now or anything at all. Not at all. But now, like I told you before, that my Russian is not like amazing. So this year I have been able to hire like interpreters to do like a proper translation. I didn't have to ask for friends. Like 8 years ago, I was like, hey, would you mind coming with me to an interview? I'll buy you a beer. And I was like, okay, how many hours? Oh, this, what price? This price, that's good. And this event has been so wild and so tragic that the media have been willing to also offer a little bit more financial support. And TVs have also helped cover the expenses. And in the end, you see that, some challenge that I didn't mention is the resources in Spain. You are on your own, really. You go there and it's you, that's it. There's no producer booking hotels, or there is no budget for you. There is pretty much nothing. Now that I have been working for more years and I have a relationship with the Confidencia and with La Sexta and with Televisión de Galicia, they were, willing to pay a little more. And they were great, and I'm grateful. So yeah, I think the coverage is much more, and also very important. Now everybody sees what's going on. In 2014, the hybrid war, launched by Russia, if you took a close look, you saw what was going on. But if you didn't, like many people, didn't because they carry on with their lives in Spain or in the US, they didn't have a clear understanding because there was a lot of propaganda, and Putin left room of maneuver for himself to say, oh, this is a civil war in Ukraine. We are the peacekeepers. There are no Russian soldiers in Ukraine, even though they were, to denying these things. And some people will buy it because it was difficult to see the troops in Ukraine. You need sources. But now it's obvious, And some people in Ukraine, some Ukrainians, when they speak to a foreign reporter, they're less touchy in the way that they know that we know what's going on. So they don't feel the need to explain some stereotypes, some things. So I think the reporting has been better.
If I'm allowed to mention this, you're now working on your next book about Ukraine. Can you say a couple of words about that?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for bringing it up. I'm working on a new book about Ukraine, and it's going to be devoted to the fall of Mariúpol. Hence the title of the talk, Saludos, desde Mariúpol. I had a chance to visit right before the large-scale invasion in February. I met a lot of people. Some of them, thank God, are alive. Some others we don't know. There is one I had lunch with, and he is now in a Russian prison. And it's tragic. So I, reached out to them, and I asked for context and witnesses, testimonies, and they have helped me out. So basically, my trip to Ukraine in July has been devoted to speaking to all of them. So I interview around 15, something like that. And I want to basically tell a story of the siege of Mariúpol from their testimonies, and also adding some context.
Well, thank you so very much for a wonderfully stimulating and interesting presentation. We are looking forward to having you again before long with the presentation of your brand new book on Mariúpol. Thank you. And as a reminder, we always do that. On October 12th, in this room, I'm going to be screening and discussing, with the participation of the director herself, a fantastic film called Stop Zemlya. It's a very, very special film. You are all invited cordially. Please mark that in your calendars. We are also looking forward to having a fantastically interesting Ukrainian writer and poet, Luba Yakimchuk, which is at the end of October. She's going to be here in person. And then today, we just found out that a sensational Ukrainian writer Luba Yakimchuk is from Luhansk. And this writer, Volodymyr Rafayenko, fares from Donetsk under the influence of Russian aggression. He was a celebrated Russian language writer living in Ukraine. He denounced Russian language. He switched to Ukrainian, and he published a very, very talented, a very interesting novel called Monde Green, translated by that gentleman who just left. He had to catch a bus to Philadelphia with apologies, but Marko Andrejczyk, the administrator of the Ukrainian Studies program and now professor of Ukrainian literature, translated it. It was published at Harvard University. So Volodymyr Rafayenko is going to be at the end of November with us. So that's one other huge event to look forward to. Consider yourself personally invited. Thank you for coming, and see you before long. See you back.